in terms of trying by any means to learn actually how big effect does have environment towards your mental well-being. I realized that in a way, for instance, when you have suffered trauma and there is no place for you to actually, I would say, open yourself up and being able to talk about what you have experienced, it becomes a big thing, whereas it actually goes back to that addiction and something that is quite big. And as you mentioned, trauma in a way of it's a phenomenon around the world. And I also believe that something that we don't actually look when we speak about trauma, even when we speak about addiction, we don't add trauma. We don't actually realize that, oh flip, this thing comes from trauma. You don't interlink those two things. And addiction plays a huge role because one would say that they're doing good whenever, even though we actually see that those people actually, I would say, they're suffering but unable to open up because of the environment they grew up in. And in a way of, and also one thing that actually plays a role in the fact that how you were raised, even though you had this, for example, most of the time here in South Africa, one thing that I've realized when young boys are being raped in a way by their uncles or by stepfathers, one thing that is their parent or of their mothers of not actually believing them, and that ends up in a way of when they are told to open up, it's quite difficult to do so. With your own experience, how can we actually look at it when it comes to that? How can we actually, I wouldn't say encourage, but actually let me use the word encourage people that have been sexual abuse survivors in a way? How do we encourage them to open up?
Well, first of all, I think you've got to get them to somebody who has been trauma trained and knows various techniques in order to calm the person down and teach them self-regulating skills in order to that they can learn to regulate their own emotions. So that's where it starts. Where it goes beyond that is that we have all kinds of new techniques. I mentioned virtual reality is starting to be experimented with. A technique called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, has done amazing things for survivors of trauma, and is very promising for the future. There are derivatives of that are being experimented with that are easier to do than EMDR, that are also starting to be very, very promising for healing. I've written a Judeo-Christian based book on just that, the process of healing and what we go through and what we do. It's called the heart model. And the heart model is designed for clinicians, but also for those that are going through the healing process so that they know what to expect and to know that there is a spiritual base under this that can help take them the rest of the way, that they can learn to forgive themselves. And by learning to forgive themselves, they can move on from their trauma. It's not healing trauma healing has nothing to do with forgiving perpetrators. That may never happen, depending on what the trauma was, and particularly sexual trauma. But we forgive, in a sense, when we say, I no longer want to see you in jail. I no longer need an apology. I no longer need anything from you to be able to move on with my life. That, in a sense, is forgiveness. And there's a solid biblical base for that.
And I believe that I realize the fact that in all of this, when it comes to trauma, people actually find it hard to forgive themselves. And at some point, they make jokes when it comes to forgiveness, because it goes back to that thing of beliefs of saying that I only forgive a person that has wronged me, instead of actually not realizing that in order for you to start the journey of healing, firstly, you need to actually forgive yourself and realize that it wasn't your fault. And something that we actually try to we self-blame ourselves, as blaming ourselves of saying that I shouldn't have been there, I should have listened, this and this and this and this, not realizing that firstly, you need to forgive yourself in order for you to act. Another thing is the fact that of self-acceptance, of accepting the fact that this thing happened to me, and was the next step actually of actually find healing or finding help. And you mentioned techniques, and I'm quite interested in your heart model, which is healing emotional effective response to trauma. So can you elaborate on what is heart model and how did you come about of actually implementing it?
The heart model is something that I started doing about 25 years ago. I read a couple of books on healing back in the 1980s and started working with the material in the 90s. My first area of expertise was substance abuse. And I came across a lot of survivors that were dealing with substances that had been sexually traumatized early in their childhood, both men and women. And I started systematizing this and looking at what the structure of healing had to do in counseling secularly. And then I took and put a spiritual overlay to that fit. I fully believe that we have to do two things. The first is, just as you were talking about earlier, is forgiving yourself and finding the way to do that. And that's confronting yourself. That's dealing with a shadow sense of yourself. All the things that you think are wrong are actually strengths that you have because of your survival. And finding how those are strengths. But that opens us up to the possibility that there's something beyond us, that there's a God or a power or a universal structure that we can tap into. I mean, it comes under a lot of different names, but as we tap into that place, we find rest, we find peace, we find ourselves. And it allows us also to connect much better to those around us. And so we start living in a world where we have a support system. We start living in a world where people are not harming us anymore. And we're not harming ourselves anymore, more importantly. And that leads us to a much better place for having a real life.
And I love the fact that you mentioned that in terms of we stop hurting ourselves anymore, because at some point that whenever we come across these things, as we start, I would say, find a way of coping mechanism, whereas we spoke about addiction, one of the big parts of coping mechanism, and actually not realizing that as much as we are taking this, we actually at the same time hurting ourselves. And when we start, we don't say that, but as time goes, you realize, oh, flip, I'm no longer the person that I am. And I'm no longer actually focusing on, I told myself that I'm focusing on healing, but I'm actually not doing it. I'm actually running away from it. That's the thing that I saw within myself. Lucky enough, I myself had self-awareness and actually realized, oh, flip, whenever I'm in a setting, whenever I drank, I realized I'm no longer enjoying this. I'm no longer doing it just for fun anymore. I'm actually running away from something. And that's the thing with today's youth when it comes to substances. We actually occasionally abuse these substances. We abuse these substances at some point that sometimes it's too late to actually find healing, in a way of one ends up killing themselves because of those drugs, or in terms of when it comes to overdosing. And one of the things that I try by any means to talk about is these kind of conversations. And as we close, in terms of close the Suicide Awareness Month, is kind of conversation that we should be having, and not actually be withholding such information, but also actually addressing such information, because that's once we start sharing such information, we'll be able to actually say, no, don't do that. Instead of doing that, do this. So you spoke about spiritual based when it comes to healing, and I would say I would associate that with holistic healing. True. I feel like this year I've learned a lot when it comes to holistic healing. And one thing that I realized is the fact that the word holistic, I didn't actually realize what it actually meant. And definitely the audience that might be listening to this episode might be actually asking themselves, when you mentioned spiritual based, what did you mean by that?
It's interesting. The Jewish tradition puts mind, body, and spirit all together in one place, and that's in the heart. That's part of Jewish law and tradition. The New Testament talks about the kingdom of God being in the heart. So it's taking care of our bodily needs and learning to take care of ourselves. It's getting our mind right and working through the hurts and the traumas and the things that get in our way. It's connecting to a spiritual part of ourselves that also connects us to everybody else. That's really what the heart model is about. It's a 10-stage model that encompasses the secular 3-phase model. The secular model of therapy, if you will, is all the introductory stuff, everything having to do with memory and having to do with healing process and coming together, and then exiting therapy. Well, the heart model embraces that, but goes through 10 stages of that. There are a number of self-help books that have listed those stages in other ways. A Courage to Heal is one of those books. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which has been on the bestseller list forever. Also talks about how important mind, body, spirit work is in order for the 3 parts of self to come together as one.
And how can I phrase this? I actually on to the internal conversation around healing. What actually makes us not actually run away from healing?
What makes us run from healing is that we don't want to experience those feelings, those